Thor Heyerdahl, the Grand Explorer. He looks somewhat like the movie star Kirk Douglas, some say. Axel Anderson's recent biography calls him a hero for the atomic age as the post-World War II crisis in the early days of the Cold War. He was a distraction from the death, the Marshall Plan, the Nuremberg trials. The world had just come out of a horrific world war with millions of deaths, a slow recovery, and the public was just getting back on their feet. Due to his knack for using the media for his own purposes, writing skills, use of photography and film, Heyerdahl became one, if not the most famous person on earth for a time. A master of public relations and a master of self-promotion. And question authority was his mantra for life. The goals of this presentation is to consider the scholarly context of the times when Thor Heyerdahl came up with his theory and undertook research on a wide variety of issues and locations. A short introduction to migration and diffusion as an old and problematic theme in archaeology, indigenous navigation in the Americas, to look at Heyerdahl's theory of a unified humanity, and a brief summary of the Tiki expedition and its implications, some of his fieldwork at Easter Island, and looking at some new research that seems to actually back up many of his ideas. And I realize this is probably one of the first lectures that at least I've given here in a long time that isn't about gold or treasures. So I asked myself, why am I giving a presentation about Thor Heyerdahl in Polynesia? And I realized I do have some connection to many of the issues raised in Heyerdahl's research and writing. My formative years were when Thor Heyerdahl and other explorers were highly visible in the world media. I never got to hear Thor Heyerdahl speak, but I heard many explorers in a travelogue lecture series when I was growing up in Richmond, Virginia. Part of the reasons why I wanted to become an archaeologist, probably around the 6th grade, was because of Thor Heyerdahl and others, especially the archaeologists like Hiram Bingham, Howard Carter, and Heinrich Schliemann that I read about, and developed kind of a naive and somewhat romantic view of archaeology at an early age. My interests overlap with Thor Heyerdahl, number one, in his love of indigenous knowledge, astronomy, navigation, engineering, technology, architecture, and the labor organization for construction of monuments. Experimental archaeology is one of my things that I do, and it was, I think, the first course I took as an undergraduate at Washington University. We went out to a forest and cut a tree down with a stone axe. And I found out very quickly by actually doing that experiment, you find out kind of what it was like. You see, yes, it can be done, but it's not all that easy. We also built Mississippian houses. We lived in them at freezing temperatures, tanned hides, made pottery, and I didn't participate in it, but some colleagues made a dugout canoe. So this is some of my work in Bolivia on experimental archaeology as applied to indigenous agricultural systems that don't exist today, but using the archaeological record to reverse engineer them to find something about them. Also, we've been involved in some reed boat experiments, and one of my students, Alexei Vranich, I'll show some of the images of one of his reed boats that he used in an experiment to move stones at Tiwanaku. Also interested in the big view of world prehistory, beyond the site, the valley, the country, or even the region, studied by most archaeologists. Migration and diffusion is a big topic that I studied a lot in graduate school, and highlighting the good, the bad, and the ugly of some of the interpretations. And then also the archaeology of movement, and my focus is more terrestrial or inland riverine systems. Heyerdahl's was more maritime, with the importance of things like the canoe, the raft, and the reed boat in shaping the history of the world, in particular the Americas. I realized the importance of water traffic, doing field work in the Bolivian Amazon. And the guys I work with, the guides that we take out in some pretty remote areas, they're always yelling at me, "Clark, why don't you come back in the rainy season when we can skim our canoes across the whole countryside and not have to lug all your gear on our backs?" Erland Nordenskjöld, many years ago, pointed out that pretty much all of South America, except the Andean region, is a giant aquatic highway. You can go from the Orinoco River, cross over the headwaters into the Amazon system, and from there going south across the Pantanal into the La Plata and down and through Argentina. A massive connection of water networks, and has serious implications for the shaping of prehistory. I'm probably a lot more open to a lot of these ideas of big movements of peoples. Having studied at the University of Illinois with Donald Lathrop, David Grove, and Tom Zeitema, that stressed a continent-wide view, and the connections can be documented by linguistics, by archaeology, by history, and also increasingly so by genetics. Migration, diffusion, and innovations. So there's sort of two polar opposites. One is independent invention, that's kind of very popular now, that peoples throughout the world have basic needs, they are adjusting to their local landscapes, and they invent the things that they need, often many times, different times, sometimes contemporaneously throughout the world. The other view, on the other end, is the idea of diffusion, and sort of the assumption is that something develops in one area and then spreads out. It's like ripples on a pond when you toss a pebble in the center of it. And this was very popular, explaining the distribution of races in early anthropology and key traits that led to what we recognize as civilization. Unfortunately, many of these views view the center as being superior peoples, cultures, technologies, and practices that overwhelm the peoples on the land rather than appreciating their own local adaptations and their own developments. And some extreme cases of hyper-migration, hyper-diffusionism are some of the Victorian notions of the West as the center of the world, the Nazi science practiced by Germans and the Aryan superiority, von Doniget's ideas about everything can be explained by extraterrestrial visitors to Earth. And these things, as we know, have political implications for rewriting histories in some cases and impacting native claims on land and indigenous pride and also their accomplishments. And unfortunately, they often raise issues of racism. David Anthony, a Penn PhD, many years ago, wrote a key article about migration. He said, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater." And he was pointing to the incredible studies of Indo-European languages and the spread of that and many cultural traits across broad areas of the old world. And we can look at the spread of peoples and cultures throughout Africa, Amazonia, Oceania, and the Western United States as other examples. And today these are addressed by multidisciplinary teams using archaeology, linguistics, ethnohistory, studying myth, oral history, genetics, geology, dating techniques, and good old-fashioned dirt archaeology, many of the things that Heyerdahl did. The art historian and anthropologist Mary Helms, writing about ancient Panama, recognized the importance that she found in the historical documents and some of the archaeological evidence of the importance of distant knowledge, as she called it, and long-distance travel, where you had elites, priests, shamans that would travel long distances across multi-ethnic boundaries to sort of see the edges of the world. And to prove they've been there, they bring things back. And they also take things with them. And she explained a lot of the distribution, a lot of what we call prestige goods or preciosities in the archaeological record from long-distance travel. We tend to underestimate how far people of the past traveled by foot, horses, mule, elephants, or even boats. And they were probably much more cosmopolitan than we give people credit for. Now, just to look at it very quickly at an example of hyperdiffusionism as applied to the Americas. When I started graduate school, my professor, Donald Lathrop, was involved with a heated debate with Dr. Betty Meggers of the Smithsonian Institute. And Betty Meggers and her colleagues had excavated a site on the coast of Ecuador, right on the beach, and they found incredible pottery. This was in the 1950s. They did some radiocarbon dates, and the dates we now know go back as far as 4,400 BC. At the time, it was the earliest pottery in the Americas. And it looked like the pottery was full-blown. It looked like it came out of nowhere. Didn't have any antecedents, didn't have any evolution from simple forms to these fancy ones. So Betty Meggers and her colleagues looked around the world. Where can we find early pottery that predates this? And they focused on Japan and the Jomon culture. We have the earliest pottery probably in the world, at least pottery vessels, and a very, very long tradition, and fishing folk, which have boats. So they explained this pottery, this find that they had, as a, sort of a freak journey of fishermen across the Pacific and shipwrecking in Ecuador and introducing the tradition of pottery. Now, pottery, sort of who cares, but it's an important element in the development of societies throughout the Americas. And so Donald Lathrop, Jim Zeiler, and Jorge Marcos decided, well, we think they're wrong because we found archaeological sites inland. These aren't fishermen. These are full-scale farmers, and over many years of research show that these were corn farmers, had most of the crops that peoples in the Americas used. And then they started to find other earlier pottery complexes in Colombia and also the central Amazon, predating it by as much as 1,000, maybe 2,000 years. And part of this was applying some techniques that the graduate and undergraduate students had learned doing Illinois archaeology of shovel scraping large areas, exposing villages. So this is a house floor of a large multifamily structure, chock full of pottery, and tells us a lot about the lifeways. And Valdivia culture has a long evolution that predates the finds that Betty Meggers and her colleagues found. And it was actually probably one of the first large villages with 2 ceremonial mounds, small in standards of late prehistory, but one of the first. And this is the village probably about 3,000, 2,000 BC. Now, some key plants and animals that Heyerdahl and others have focused on, a lot of this research goes back to the 1800s and really became serious around 1930 and through the 60s or so. A couple of important things like the gourd and sweet potatoes. So we now know the gourd is probably the oldest domesticated plant in the world. It has wide distribution, almost anybody that could grow it. Sort of requires a somewhat tropical environment, spread throughout the world because of its usefulness for all kinds of things. You can see the different kinds of vessels you can get out of it for fish floats, storage, waterproof storage, all kinds of things. And so it's natural that people would pick this up and spread it around. Now the problem with gourds is that the seeds can be eaten by a bird, and a bird could fly a long ways, poop it out, and you have the plant being spread different areas. So it could also float for long periods of time. They've done experiments on this. So it's probably not the best candidate necessarily to definitely prove that humans have moved it around, although personally I believe that. The sweet potato is a different story. It doesn't float. And it shows up throughout the Americas very early, at least by 6,000 BC, maybe earlier. And it shows up in late prehistory all over Polynesia, well documented. Also, archaeologically, it's been dated to a context of about 1200 AD and carbonized remains in good archaeological context. So we definitely know that crop spread. And there's an interesting